The alien armor didn't fear weapons. It feared the people wearing them. The scream of tortured metal echoed through the royal chamber as another knight was thrown backward by a pulse of blue light. His silver ceremonial armor scraped across the polished white floor, sparks trailing behind him before he finally slammed into a marble pillar with a groan. Above the chaos, warning sirens pulsed through the vaulted ceiling in slow, mechanical rhythms. Red emergency glyphs flashed across ancient stone walls carved thousands of years before humans had ever touched the stars. At the center of the chamber, Princess Lysara knelt trapped inside what looked less like armor and more like a living machine. Dark silver plates wrapped around her body in shifting layers, contracting tighter every few seconds with a grinding hiss that made the watching engineers flinch. Thin streams of glowing blue fluid leaked from microscopic seams near her shoulders, dripping onto the white floor below like liquid neon. Her breathing came shallow now. Controlled. Careful. Every breath seemed to anger the armor further. "Do not touch the restraint hinges," one royal engineer shouted as a hovering drone descended toward the princess with glowing plasma tools extended from its chassis. The suit interprets aggression as a threat response. The drone barely reached her before the armor reacted again. A violent burst of electromagnetic force detonated outward. Lights flickered. Holographic displays shattered into static. The drone spun across the chamber, trailing smoke before crashing into a row of ancient banners. Several armored knights stepped back instinctively. None of them wanted to be next. Princess Lysara lowered her head slightly as another metallic click echoed beneath the armor plates surrounding her ribs. Even from 40 feet away, the sound carried through the chamber like an old ship engine grinding itself apart. "Her oxygen levels are dropping," another engineer whispered. "The royal biosuit is constricting further." "Then override it," barked Commander Valor, his gold-trimmed armor reflecting the chamber's emergency lights. Sweat glistened along his pale violet skin despite the cold air. "We have attempted 73 override sequences," the engineer replied quietly. "The armor rejects all authority access." Valor cursed under his breath and drew a long silver blade from his hip. The weapon hummed with contained plasma energy. Several nearby guards straightened immediately. "If the mechanism is damaged," he said, stepping toward the princess, "then we force it open." "Commander!" "No." The moment the blade came within inches of the armor, every light in the chamber died. Darkness swallowed the room. Then came the sound. A deep mechanical shriek rose from inside the armor itself. Not electronic. Not synthetic. Almost alive. Emergency backup systems flickered on a second later, bathing the chamber in dim crimson light. The armor had tightened again. Princess Lysara trembled as another sharp hiss escaped the seams near her spine. Valor froze. For the first time since entering the chamber, genuine fear crossed the commander's face. Then, somewhere behind the gathered nobles and engineers, a tired voice spoke calmly over the alarms. "You people ever stop to think maybe the thing's panicking?" Heads turned instantly. Standing near the massive entrance doors was a man in a stained brown work jacket carrying a dented steel toolbox in one hand. Human. Mid-30s maybe. White guy. Broad shoulders. Grease smudged across one sleeve. He looked wildly out of place beneath the glowing cathedral ceiling and the towering alien statues surrounding him. Mason Reed glanced around at the horrified faces staring back at him. "What?" he muttered. "I'm just here to fix docking bay 12. The chamber fell silent except for the grinding sounds coming from the royal armor. Hundreds of tiny mechanisms shifted beneath the silver plates wrapped around Princess Lysara's body, each movement followed by another strained breath from the alien princess. Mason Reed adjusted the weight of his toolbox in one hand and immediately regretted speaking. Every eye in the room locked onto him at once. Royal guards tightened their grip on pulse spears. Engineers stared at him like he had wandered into the wrong universe. Commander Valor stepped forward first. His polished armor reflected the chamber's crimson emergency lights in sharp streaks across the floor. "Who allowed this human inside the sanctum?" he demanded. Mason shrugged slightly. "The docking supervisor with the missing left antenna." Nobody answered. Somewhere above them, warning sirens continued their slow pulse through the cathedral ceiling. Mason glanced toward the princess again. The armor around her chest tightened with another metallic hiss. He could hear it clearly now beneath the alarms and shouting. Dry friction. Old rotational lock joints. Not electronic failure. Mechanical resistance. The same sound cargo haulers made after 6 months without maintenance. "You are staring at Her Highness," Vaylor snapped. Either kneel or leave immediately. Mason blinked once. Buddy, I fix coolant recyclers for a living. I do not know your kneeling rules. A horrified murmur spread through the chamber. One of the royal scholars nearly dropped a glowing datapad. Princess Lysara slowly raised her head despite the armor constricting around her shoulders. Her golden eyes settled on the human standing near the entrance. Confusion flickered across her face. He looked nothing like the warriors surrounding her. No polished armor. No ceremonial robes. Just worn boots, rough hands, and a brown jacket stained with grease around the sleeves. Human. Ordinary. Completely unimpressed by royal panic. Remove him, Vaylor ordered coldly. Two guards stepped toward Mason immediately, but before they reached him, another violent metallic shriek erupted from the armor. The entire chamber vibrated. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams overhead. Princess Lysara gasped sharply as another layer around her ribs locked into place. Every engineer froze. One whispered something about rising compression pressure. Mason frowned. Okay, yeah, he muttered quietly. That thing is definitely seizing up. Vaylor rounded on him. You know nothing about royal biosuits. No, Mason admitted. But I know machines. He set the steel toolbox down on the marble floor with a heavy clank. The sound echoed strangely beneath the vaulted ceiling. And right now your machine sounds scared to death. Several engineers exchanged uncertain looks. One older technician near the rear of the chamber hesitated before speaking. Commander, the human may have identified an instability pattern. Vaylor glared at him. The armor is a sacred relic older than your species. It does not experience fear. Mason slowly crouched near the edge of the chamber floor, listening carefully now. He ignored the guards surrounding him, ignored the nobles whispering insults under their breath. The armor emitted another low click. Then another. Tight rhythm. Not random. There, Mason said softly. Hear that? Nobody answered. He pointed toward the princess without getting too close. Front spinal hinge. Probably binding under stress response. An engineer frowned. Impossible. The suit maintains itself automatically. Mason gave a dry laugh. Yeah, every mechanic hears that right before something explodes. To everyone's shock, Princess Lysara let out the faintest sound that almost resembled a laugh herself. Short, painfully restrained, but real. Vaylor noticed immediately. His expression darkened. Human, he warned. If your ignorance worsens her condition, I will personally remove you from this palace. Mason stood slowly and wiped his hands against his jacket. Then maybe stop threatening the only guy here actually listening to the machine. The chamber went quiet again. Even the engineers stopped moving. Because beneath the alarms and emergency lights, they could all hear it now. Click, grind, click. Like the armor was trying very hard to say something nobody understood. The grinding noise inside the royal armor grew louder after the chamber finally fell quiet enough to hear it properly. Not random, not chaotic, rhythmic. Like an old engine struggling against pressure it was never designed to carry. Mason Reed stepped closer despite the guards shifting nervously around him. Every polished weapon in the room followed his movement. He ignored them. His attention stayed fixed on the armor wrapped around Princess Lysara's body. Up close, the thing looked even stranger. The silver plates were not connected by visible seams or bolts. They flowed together like overlapping scales beneath faint blue light pulsing under the surface. Tiny symbols moved slowly across the metal as though the armor itself was thinking, breathing, watching. Mason crouched carefully about 6 feet away. Do not approach further. Commander Vaylor warned immediately. The suit may identify you as hostile. Mason tilted his head slightly. Funny, he muttered. Seems like it already thinks you are. Several engineers looked visibly uncomfortable at that. Princess Lysara lowered her gaze toward the human mechanic. Sweat shimmered faintly along her pale blue skin now. The armor around her shoulders contracted again with a sharp metallic click that made her wince. Mason heard it instantly. Dry hinge friction. Pressure lock. He knew the sound too well. He had spent 15 years crawling through overheated cargo freighters and broken refinery loaders across half the outer colonies. Machines always told the truth eventually. You just had to shut up long enough to listen. What is your name, human? The princess asked softly. Her voice carried surprising steadiness despite the strain in her breathing. Mason glanced up. Mason Reed, you truly believe you understand royal biomechanical systems? One scholar demanded with open disbelief. Mason shrugged. Nope. The chamber stirred with offended whispers again. But I understand when something is stuck. Another painful hiss escaped from beneath the armor around Lysara's ribs. The glowing symbols running across the silver surface suddenly flickered red for half a second. Several nearby engineers recoiled. Compression pressure increasing, one technician warned quietly. Internal temperature is rising another 3 degrees. Mason frowned. Heat buildup. Locked joints. Escalating resistance. The armor was fighting itself now. When did this start? He asked. Vaylor crossed his arms. During the ceremonial synchronization. Meaning? The princess bonded with the armor, as every royal heir has done for centuries. Mason nodded slowly. And? Nobody answered immediately. Princess Lasara finally spoke herself. The armor accepted me at first. Her breathing caught briefly before continuing. Then it changed. Mason studied the silver. Plates tightening around her arms. Did anybody force the synchronization process? Several nobles exchanged nervous glances. Vaylor's expression hardened instantly. Mind your station, human. Mason noticed the silence anyway. Machines did not panic for no reason. Neither did people. He reached slowly toward his toolbox and opened the rusted side latch. The metallic snap echoed loudly through the chamber. Several guards immediately raised their weapons. Mason rolled his eyes. Relax. It is a wrench, not a bomb. He rummaged through old tools, worn gloves, loose bolts, and cracked sensor readers before pulling out a small flashlight. Nothing advanced. Nothing elegant. Pure human utility. He aimed the light toward the armor joints near Lasara's spine. The beam reflected off layers of microscopic scoring hidden beneath the silver surface. Mason's expression shifted slightly. Well, there is your problem. One engineer stepped closer cautiously. What do you see? Mason pointed toward the tiny scratches running along the hinge assembly. Someone kept trying to force the locking rings open. Silence hit the chamber like vacuum exposure. Vaylor's jaw tightened. Princess Lasara looked up sharply. Mason exhaled slowly through his nose. And now the armor thinks everybody touching it wants to hurt her. The grinding sound inside the suit suddenly stopped. Not completely, just enough to notice. Like the machine itself was listening. For the first time since Mason Reed entered the chamber, nobody argued with him. The grinding sounds inside the royal armor had softened into quieter mechanical clicks, uneven but slower now, like an engine idling after nearly burning itself apart. Emergency lights continued flashing crimson across the vaulted ceiling, washing the white marble floor in pulses of red and shadow. Princess Lasara remained trapped at the center of the chamber, but the crushing pressure around her chest no longer tightened every few seconds. Even her breathing sounded steadier. The engineers noticed it too. Compression rate has stabilized, one technician whispered, staring at floating diagnostics projected above a silver console. That should not be possible. Mason barely listened. He stepped closer again, flashlight beam tracing across the armor's overlapping plates. Tiny blue symbols drifted beneath the surface like currents moving under frozen water. Ancient technology. Beautiful engineering. Completely neglected maintenance. You said this armor is thousands of years old? He asked without looking away from the suit. One elderly scholar adjusted the glowing lenses over his eyes. The royal biosuit predates our modern empire itself. It is considered sacred. Mason nodded slowly. Yeah, that is usually how old machines die. Vaylor looked personally offended by the sentence. You compare our most revered artifact to industrial machinery. Buddy, Mason replied calmly. Everything becomes industrial machinery eventually. He crouched near the princess again. The guards tensed immediately, but Lasara lifted one trembling hand slightly. A silent signal for them to stop. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the human mechanic. Curious now, not fearful. What are you listening for? She asked quietly. Mason tilted his head toward the armor. Stress chatter. Several engineers exchanged confused looks. Mason tapped lightly against the marble floor beside him with 2 fingers. Machines tell you things before they fail. Tiny noises. Tiny vibrations. Most people ignore them because computers usually handle everything. He glanced around the chamber at the hovering drones, shattered holographic displays, and panicking royal technicians. Then one day the machine gets tired of being ignored. A faint sound escaped Lasara that almost resembled amusement again. Vaylor clearly did not appreciate it. Enough philosophy, the commander snapped. Can you remove the armor or not? Mason exhaled slowly and opened his toolbox again. The hinges squealed softly from age. Inside sat dozens of ordinary human tools. Socket wrenches, steel pliers, rolls of electrical tape, scratched screwdrivers with faded rubber grips. Nothing elegant, nothing royal. One young engineer stared openly at the collection. Those devices are entirely manual. Yep. Without neural assistance? That is generally how screwdrivers work. The engineer blinked. Several times. Mason reached deeper into the toolbox and paused. Then he pulled out a dented blue and yellow spray can covered in scratches and oil stains. Several alien scholars leaned forward in confusion. Vaylor narrowed his eyes immediately. What is that? Mason shook the can once. The tiny metal ball inside rattled sharply through the silent chamber. Honestly, he said, about 80% of human engineering. Princess Lasara stared at the object in his hand. It is medicine? Mason grinned faintly for the first time since arriving. For machines, mostly. One royal scientist stepped forward cautiously. What chemical compound does it contain? Mason looked at the faded label. I stopped asking that question years ago. Vaylor's expression darkened dangerously. You intend to spray an unidentified primitive substance onto royal sacred armor? Mason glanced toward the princess. The silver plates around her shoulders emitted another strained metallic click. Tiny sparks flickered briefly beneath one hinge assembly near her spine. Dry friction, binding pressure, escalating heat. He had seen truck axles do the exact same thing crossing desert freight routes on Mars. Your sacred armor needs lubricant, Mason said simply. Half the chamber reacted like he had insulted their ancestors. But Princess Lasara never looked away from him. And if you are wrong? She asked softly. Mason met her glowing golden eyes across the flashing crimson chamber lights. Then he gently set the can beside his toolbox and answered in the calmest voice there. Then I will be wrong trying to help instead of standing around terrified of a machine. The entire royal chamber watched Mason read like he was about to commit sacrilege. Crimson emergency lights pulsed across the marble floor while the ancient armor surrounding Princess Lasara emitted low metallic clicks that echoed through the massive hall. The sound reminded Mason of overheated brake systems on freight haulers descending steep canyon roads back on Earth. Too much pressure. Too little movement. Something was locking itself tighter out of fear. Mason slowly picked up the dented spray can from beside his toolbox. The metal felt cool in his hand despite the rising heat inside the chamber. Around him, royal guards stood rigid with pulse weapons raised halfway. Nervous. Uncertain. Like they were waiting for the armor itself to attack again. Human, Commander Vaylor warned carefully. If your chemical damages the royal biosuit, history will remember your species for this insult. Mason sighed quietly. History remembers humans for way worse things than lubricant. A few younger engineers exchanged confused glances at that. Princess Lasara lowered her head slightly as another pressure wave rolled through the armor around her shoulders. This time Mason noticed something important. The suit no longer reacted aggressively toward him. No pulses. No electromagnetic bursts. The glowing blue symbols drifting beneath the silver surface had slowed. Watching. Listening. Okay. Mason murmured softly as he crouched beside her. Easy now. The words were not directed at the princess. They were for the machine. Several alien scholars looked disturbed by that realization. Mason carefully examined the hinge assembly near Lasara's spine. Tiny silver locking rings had fused together under heat and pressure. Ancient engineering. Beautiful engineering. Completely dry. Nobody serviced this thing? He asked quietly. One elderly archivist answered with visible confusion. The armor is self-sustaining. Mason nodded once. That is mechanic language for nobody checked it in 500 years. He slid the thin red straw attachment onto the spray nozzle with practiced fingers. The tiny clicks sounded absurdly small inside the enormous chamber. Every person present stared at the can in his hand like it contained unstable explosives. Mason gave the can a short shake. Rattle, rattle, rattle. The familiar sound almost made him smile. It reminded him of repair bays. Cargo docks. Long nights under failing engines while snowstorms hammered metal roofs overhead. Human places. Honest places. Not giant palaces full of people terrified to touch their own machines. Princess Lasara watched him carefully. Her glowing golden eyes reflected the flashing crimson lights overhead. You truly believe this will help? She asked softly. Mason met her gaze for a moment. Honestly, he glanced back at the armor. I think the machine just wants someone to stop fighting it. Then he leaned closer and aimed the nozzle toward the seized hinge near her shoulder blade. Commander Vaylor immediately stepped forward. Wait. Mason paused. The entire chamber froze. Vaylor stared at the ancient armor wrapped around his princess. At the exhausted engineers. At the silent machine that had rejected every weapon and override command they possessed. Slowly, reluctantly, the commander stepped back. Proceed, he said quietly. Mason exhaled once through his nose. Then he pressed the nozzle. Hisses. The sound cut through the chamber like a whisper. A fine mist coated the silver hinge assembly. For one terrifying second nothing happened. Then came the noise. Click. A tiny movement. Barely visible. But real. Several engineers gasped aloud. Mason sprayed another short burst. Hisses. Click. Grind. The locked silver rings shifted slightly apart. Blue warning glyphs flickering across the armor suddenly dimmed from crimson back to soft blue. Princess Lysara inhaled sharply as the pressure around her ribs loosened for the first time in hours. The chamber went completely silent. No alarms. No shouting. Just the quiet mechanical sound of ancient metal finally moving again. Mason stared at the hinge assembly with the calm focus of a man repairing an old truck engine beside a highway. There you are, he whispered gently. That is better. Then the armor did something nobody in the chamber had ever seen before. It unlocked itself. The sound of unlocking mechanisms rolled through the royal chamber like distant thunder. One by one, the silver plates surrounding Princess Lysara shifted apart with slow mechanical precision. Not violently. Carefully. Deliberately. Ancient hinges rotated beneath the armor's glowing surface, while streams of soft blue light pulsed between the opening seams. Every engineer in the chamber stood frozen in disbelief. The royal biosuit had not obeyed override commands in centuries. Yet now it moved willingly beneath the hands of a tired human mechanic holding a scratched can of lubricant. Mason Reed remained crouched beside the princess, watching the hinge assembly loosen another fraction of an inch. Easy, he murmured quietly. No need to rush. Another soft hiss escaped the armor as pressure seals disengaged around Lysara's shoulders. The princess inhaled deeply for the first time since the synchronization ceremony began. The sound was shaky but real. Relief spread visibly across her face. The chamber noticed immediately. A young royal technician stared at the floating diagnostic display above his console. Respiratory pressure stabilizing. He whispered in disbelief. Neural strain falling rapidly. Commander Vaylor looked less certain of everything with each passing second. His rigid posture remained intact, but Mason could see it in his eyes now. Confusion. Not because a human succeeded. Because the armor itself had chosen cooperation. The silver plates around Lysara's arms slowly folded backward with elegant mechanical grace. Beneath them, glowing circuitry pulsed softly against pale blue skin. Ancient engineering blended with biology so seamlessly it looked almost alive. Mason had repaired machines his entire life, but this thing felt different. Not smarter. Older. Like it had learned patience over thousands of years. The princess lowered her gaze toward him as another lock disengaged near her ribs. You speak to it, she said softly. Mason shrugged slightly. Talking helps me think. No, Lysara replied quietly. It listens to you. The chamber fell silent again after that. Because nobody could deny it anymore. The armor reacted differently around him. Calmly. Like a frightened animal finally recognizing someone safe enough to approach. Mason reached toward another seized hinge carefully, moving slowly enough to avoid startling the machine. He applied a second short burst of lubricant into the rotating lock assembly near her spine. Hisses. Tiny mechanical clicks answered immediately. Then another section unlocked. The emergency warning lights above the chamber suddenly dimmed from crimson to soft gold. One by one, the screaming alarms finally shut off. The silence afterward felt enormous. Clean. Sacred almost. Several royal scholars stared upward in shock. The biosuit has exited threat response mode, an engineer whispered. Impossible. Mason wiped his hands against his stained jacket. Machines calm down when people stop attacking them. A final sequence of soft metallic sounds echoed through the chamber. Then the chest plate separated completely from the rest of the armor and folded outward like silver wings. Princess Lysara gasped softly as the crushing pressure around her lungs disappeared. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. For a moment, she simply sat there breathing slowly while cool air drifted through the now open armor frame. The massive chamber watched in complete silence. No triumphant music. No dramatic speeches. Just the quiet sound of someone finally able to breathe again. Then Lysara's balance shifted unexpectedly. Hours trapped inside the armor had drained her strength completely. Before the nearby guards could react, Mason reached forward instinctively and steadied her carefully by the arm. The armor did not retaliate, did not pulse, did not tighten. Instead, the glowing blue symbols beneath its surface softened into slow waves of light, drifting peacefully across the silver metal. The ancient machine accepted the contact. Princess Lasara looked down at the human hand supporting her arm. Rough fingers, oil stains along the knuckles, small scars from years spent repairing things nobody else cared enough to fix. Her golden eyes lifted slowly toward his face. Mason Reed, she said quietly, almost like she was testing the name itself. Yes. For the first time since entering the chamber, the alien princess smiled. Small, exhausted, genuine. I believe, she whispered softly. The armor likes you more than my royal court. By the time the emergency crews finally powered down the last warning systems, the royal chamber no longer felt like the center of a catastrophe. It felt like the aftermath of an argument everyone suddenly regretted. Engineers moved quietly now. Careful, respectful. Even the hovering drones kept their distance from the opened armor resting behind Princess Lasara like folded silver wings. The machine remained active, but calm. Soft blue. Light drifted beneath its surface in slow rhythmic pulses that matched the princess's breathing almost perfectly. Mason Reed sat cross-legged beside his steel toolbox near the edge of the chamber floor, wiping old lubricant residue from his hands with a rag pulled from his jacket pocket. The adrenaline had finally worn off. Exhaustion settled into his shoulders like wet concrete. He had originally come to the palace to repair a broken cargo docking system. Now half the royal court stared at him like he had rewritten physics. Human, a voice called carefully from behind him. Mason looked up. The elderly royal archivist approached slowly carrying a thin crystal tablet, glowing with pale gold symbols. Unlike the others, the old scholar no longer looked offended by Mason's presence. If anything, he looked unsettled in a completely different way. You said earlier that machines speak, the archivist said quietly. Mason shrugged. Sure, that phrase exists within the oldest translations of our founding texts. Mason blinked once. Okay. The archivist activated the crystal tablet. Ancient symbols rotated slowly above its surface before resolving into translated standard text. The guardians of the throne shall answer not to command, but to calm hands and patient hearts. Silence spread across the nearby engineers listening in. The archivist looked toward the opened armor behind Lasara. For centuries we interpreted this metaphorically. Mason leaned back against his toolbox. That usually means somebody ignored the manual. A younger scholar frowned thoughtfully. You believe the armor was intentionally designed to resist authority? No, Mason replied. I think it was designed to recognize fear. The chamber grew quiet again after that. Princess Lasara sat nearby beneath a thermal cloak draped around her shoulders while medical scanners hovered softly around her. Her color had returned gradually over the last hour. The strain in her breathing was gone now, replaced by thoughtful silence. She watched Mason continuously whenever he was not looking directly at her. Our engineers believed greater force would restore control, Valor admitted from across the chamber. The commander sounded older suddenly. Tired. That is because your engineers think like soldiers, Mason replied. Machines are not impressed by dominance. One of the technicians nearby slowly nodded in understanding. The armor escalated every time we attempted override procedures. Exactly. Mason pointed toward the open biosuit. You kept proving its threat detection correct. Lasara lowered her gaze briefly. And you did not. Mason looked genuinely confused by the statement. Princess, I spent 10 years repairing freight engines in dust storms on Titan Station. Talking calmly to angry machinery is basically my whole career. To his surprise, several nearby engineers laughed quietly at that. The tension inside the chamber loosened for the first time all night. Even Valor's expression softened slightly. The archivist studied Mason carefully. There are records, he said slowly, of ancient contact between our earliest civilization and travelers from Earth long before modern galactic history acknowledges human expansion. Mason raised an eyebrow. You are telling me ancient aliens left behind a machine that responds positively to mechanics with trust issues? The old scholar considered that seriously. When phrased in such a manner, perhaps. Lasara suddenly smiled again, brighter this time. Warm enough to briefly erase the exhaustion from her face. Mason noticed several members of the royal court staring at her in surprise. Apparently their princess did not smile often. The opened armor behind her emitted one final soft mechanical hum before settling completely dormant. Not dead. Resting. Mason glanced back toward it quietly. Then toward the scratch spray can still sitting beside his toolbox. You know, he muttered. Back home this stuff costs about $8 at a hardware store. No one in the chamber knew what a hardware store was. But judging by the looks on their faces, they were beginning to suspect humanity might be far stranger than they originally thought. 3 days later, Mason Reed was back where he belonged, beneath bad lighting, surrounded by broken machinery. The docking maintenance bay beneath the Royal Palace smelled like overheated wiring, hydraulic fluid, and recycled air struggling through old filtration systems. To Mason, it smelled comforting. Real. Sparks flashed overhead as a cargo lift groaned somewhere deeper in the station. Massive industrial fans rotated slowly above rows of grounded transports waiting for repairs. Nobody bowed here. Nobody whispered about sacred relics. Machines either worked or they did not. Mason preferred that kind of honesty. He lay halfway beneath an open service crawler with a wrench clenched between grease-stained fingers while an old Terran rock song played quietly from a portable speaker beside his toolbox. "Come on," he muttered toward the machine. "You survived atmospheric re-entry twice. Do not get dramatic now." The engine answered with an ugly metallic clunk. Mason nodded once. "Yeah, that sounds about right." Footsteps echoed softly across the metal walkway behind him. Light. Careful. Not military boots. Mason slid himself out from beneath the crawler and immediately froze in surprise. Princess Lasara stood near the entrance of the maintenance bay wrapped in a dark blue travel cloak instead of royal ceremonial clothing. Without the armor surrounding her, she looked strangely different. Smaller somehow. More real. Her silver blue skin reflected the industrial lighting softly, while strands of pale white hair drifted slightly in the ventilation currents overhead. 2 royal guards remained near the far doorway, clearly uncomfortable standing inside a place covered in grease and hanging tools. Lasara ignored them completely. Her attention stayed fixed on Mason's cluttered workstation. "You repaired the docking bay," she said quietly. Mason glanced toward the massive hydraulic doors now functioning smoothly behind her. That was the original job. Her golden eyes moved slowly across the room. Open engine parts. Loose cables. Stacks of worn tools organized in ways only Mason understood. "This is where you are most comfortable," she observed. Mason shrugged and tossed the wrench onto the workbench with a metallic clank. "Machines make sense." Lasara stepped closer to the crawler Mason had been repairing. "This transport is over 30 years. "Oh, 32. Mason corrected automatically. Fuel injector manifold cracked during cargo descent. The princess tilted her head slightly. "You remember machines the way scholars remember history." Mason wiped his hands with an old rag. "Machines have history." For a moment neither spoke. The low hum of industrial generators filled the silence between them while sparks flickered somewhere deeper in the repair bay. Lasara reached out carefully toward the crawler's damaged engine housing. Her fingers hovered above the scratched metal surface. "Our engineers would replace this entire system," she said softly. "Probably. Yet you repair it instead." Mason leaned against the workbench behind him. "Because replacement is expensive." Lasara looked back at him. "That is not the real reason." Mason smiled faintly. "Smart princess." "No," he admitted quietly. "It is not." He picked up a small rusted component from the workbench and turned it between his fingers. "Most things break because nobody listens when the problems are small." Lasara watched him carefully now, the same way the armor once had. Curious. Patient. "And humans listen?" she asked. Mason glanced around the maintenance bay, at the patched cargo haulers. The old service bots still functioning decades past retirement. The cracked tools repaired with tape instead of discarded. "Humans get attached to broken things," he said finally. The princess grew quiet after that. Somewhere nearby, compressed air hissed through an automated valve line. Mason returned the rusted component to the table beside the scratched blue and yellow spray can still sitting near his toolbox. Lasara noticed it immediately. "That small container saved my life," she said softly. Mason laughed under his breath. Back home people mostly use it to fix squeaky garage doors. To his surprise, Lasara smiled again. Warmer this time. Less royal. More personal. Then her gaze shifted toward Mason's rough hands resting against the workbench. Small scars crossed his knuckles beneath old grease stains. Signs of years spent rebuilding things nobody else considered worth saving. "You truly believe machines can feel fear?" she asked quietly. Mason looked toward the maintenance crawler beside them. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. "No," he said after a moment. "But I think people put pieces of themselves into the things they build." The princess did not answer immediately. She simply stood there listening to the sounds of human repair work echoing softly through the station. And for the first time in her life, the future ruler of an empire realized why humanity unsettled the galaxy so much. Humans did not worship perfection. They trusted repair. 6 months later, visitors from across the empire traveled through the palace halls just to see the object displayed beneath the central dome of the Royal Museum. Some expected a legendary weapon. Others expected ancient alien technology recovered from lost worlds. The royal biosuit itself rested nearby behind a towering field of transparent energy, silver plates glowing softly beneath controlled lighting, while scholars lectured endlessly about the historical synchronization event that nearly changed the succession line forever. But it was not the armor drawing the largest crowds anymore. It was the small scratched blue and yellow spray can displayed alone beneath a circular glass case at the center of the room. The metal surface still carried faded fingerprints beneath old oil stains. One side of the label had partially peeled away from years spent rolling around inside a mechanic's toolbox. Beneath the display case, a silver plaque carried a single inscription translated into 12 galactic languages. The tool that succeeded where pride failed. Some visitors laughed when they first saw it, until the royal guides explained the story. Then the laughter usually stopped. High above the museum floor, Princess Lysara stood quietly along a balcony overlooking the exhibit hall below. Her silver ceremonial robes shimmered softly beneath the evening lights while nobles and diplomats moved through the museum beneath her like slow currents in deep water. Beside her stood Commander Valor with his hands folded behind his back. The trade delegates from the Orion systems requested private access to the relic again, he said carefully. Lysara hid a smile. It is a spray lubricant, Valor. It is now considered a symbol of adaptive reasoning throughout 3 allied sectors. The commander paused slightly. There are even military academies teaching your encounter with the biosuit as a strategic case study. Lysara looked down toward the crowded exhibit hall again. Human visitors passed through the museum too now. Engineers mostly. Mechanics. Cargo pilots. Ordinary people wearing work jackets and steel-toe boots instead of polished uniforms. Many of them stared at the spray can with amused disbelief, like they could not decide whether humanity should feel proud or embarrassed. And where is the human responsible for this diplomatic revolution? Valor asked quietly. Lysara's smile finally appeared fully this time. Late, probably. As if summoned by the statement itself, the museum doors below slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Mason Reed stepped inside carrying a battered toolbox in one hand and a half-finished cup of station coffee in the other. His brown work jacket still carried fresh grease stains across one sleeve. Several nearby nobles instantly recognized him and straightened with visible surprise. Mason barely noticed. His attention stayed fixed on the maintenance drone floating beside him with one flickering sensor eye. I told you replacing the power relay first was stupid, he muttered toward the drone. Now your entire navigation system is confused. The drone emitted a frustrated electronic chirp. Yeah, well, welcome to engineering. Lysara watched from above as museum guests slowly parted around the human mechanic responsible for one of the most discussed events in recent royal history. Some bowed respectfully now when he passed. Others simply stared. Mason still looked uncomfortable every single time. He refuses every official title we offer him, Valor observed quietly. Last week he declined appointment as Royal Chief Engineer because he claimed the palace ventilation system gives him headaches. It does, Lysara replied. Down below, Mason finally noticed the massive crowd gathered around the display case holding the famous spray can. He stopped walking immediately. Oh, come on, he muttered under his breath. One small child near the exhibit pointed excitedly toward him. That is him, she whispered loudly to her parents. Mason looked genuinely horrified by the attention. Lysara laughed softly beneath her breath before turning toward the staircase leading down to the museum floor. Where are you going? Valor asked. The princess glanced back once. To rescue a mechanic from diplomacy. Then she descended toward the crowded hall below, while soft blue light reflected